Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Slow Art Friday. My name is Christy McMillan, and I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the Asheville Art Museum. I'm joined by Hank Bovee, one of our touring docents who will be leading today's discussion. Each Friday at 12 p.m., docents lead virtual interactive conversations about a few artworks in our collection or special exhibitions. The goal is simple: slow down, discover the joy of looking at art, and talk about the experience with others. For today's program, Hank will lead us in an interactive conversation about 3 artworks in our collection. Sorry, 4 artworks, not in our collection, 4 artworks in our special exhibition, Our Strength is Our People, the Humanist Photographs of Lewis Hine. We'll spend about 15 minutes or so with each one. Hank will allow us time to look at each work on our own, slowly, before leading a conversation with questions. As participants, we encourage you to engage in dialogue with Hank, myself, and each other throughout the hour. A few notes before we get started. You probably noticed that your microphones and video are muted by default. You are welcome to turn on your video at any time. It's always nicer to talk to talking heads than to black boxes. And in just a moment, I'll also make it so that you can turn on your microphone. Choose a quiet room and close the door. Please silence any alerts from nearby devices, as they can be distracting during the conversation. If you do choose to turn on your video, try not to sit in front of a lamp, window, or other strong source of light or movement, as it can make it hard for us to see you. Use headphones and microphone for best sound quality. While you can log in using a smartphone, please use a desktop, laptop, or tablet in order to see slides and meeting tools on a larger screen. Make sure that your screen name includes your first name and last initial, or first name and last name, so that we know who we're talking to. There are 3 ways to ask questions or make comments during today's program. The easiest way is just to unmute your microphone when Hank or I ask for questions or comments, and to jump in and contribute. A second way is to type any questions or comments that you have into the chat box, or to raise your hand in the participant sidebar, and I'll call on you and ask you to unmute your microphone. Typing or raising your hand can sometimes take a while to get to participants, so we just encourage you to jump right in. Finally, we are recording. If you prefer not to be recorded, make sure that your video and audio remain muted, and use the chat box to submit any questions or comments that you have. I'm going to make it now so that folks can unmute themselves. Does anybody have any questions before we get started? All right, Hank, what will we be talking about today?
Well, good morning, everybody. And as Chrissy said, this morning or this afternoon, we're going to talk about 4 artworks from Our Strength is Our People exhibit at the Asheville Art Museum. You noticed earlier she stumbled and said 3 artworks. Normally, our Slow Art Fridays are 3 artworks. But when I was putting together today's program, I could not narrow it down any farther than these 4. I liked them too much. So we're going to squeeze in 4 today. And since these were all by the same artist, I'm going to go ahead and give you a little information about the artist ahead of time. The artist or photographer that we're looking at today is Lewis Hine. And he's actually is not a trained artist. He started out life trained as a teacher. And he was taught in Chicago, born in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. He got a job in New York at a progressive school called the Ethical Culture School. And they did a field trip to Ellis to do some photographs. And that's kind of where he got the idea that how valuable documentary photography was to education. So in addition to the Ellis Island, he also spent nearly 10 years as a photographer for the National Child Labor Committee, contributing to exhibitions and the organization's publication. And during that time, he showed a lot of things about child labor that needed to be corrected. And those of you that are familiar with the history of child labor, it was pretty ugly. And then we'll look at some of those photographs. In addition to that, he also did some commercial products. He photographed the construction of the Empire State Building. We're not going to look at any of those today, but they are included in the exhibit if you get a chance to get down to the museum. He also did some documenting of the American worker. So we'll look at some of those today as well. So with that said, how today is going to work for those of you that may not have been on a Slow Art Friday before is we'll look at an image. I'll give you a few moments to look it over. and then we'll talk about it. So with that said, Christy, if you would go ahead and put the first image up there. And you all just take a few moments to look at this, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, folks, so what do you think is going on in this photograph?
Unmute. It looks like they've just gotten off the boat. And I know I've seen this photograph before. I think it's Italian, but I could be wrong. I'm just trying to remember. I mean, this is a very well-known photographer. And it looks like, you know, especially the children, the little boy, it looks like they're in awe. They're not quite sure what's going on. And they're waiting to get through immigration.
So, and you hit a lot of nails on the head there with your observation. And yes, they are pretty much off the boat, so to speak, you know, and they are, I think they're looking for lost luggage. And they're Ellis Island immigrants. So the children obviously are kind of confused. So all very good. What else can we see?
Desperation.
I was going to say something similar, Micah. I'm going to say they look kind of scared. I mean, I imagine that if I were just sort of stepping into the unknown, and especially if this woman is by herself with these 3 kids, I would probably be pretty terrified. And she has sort of a look of real uncertainty and sort of trepidation on her face. And like Micah said, desperation, kind of.
Yep.
I'm struck by the ropes holding her, I guess that's her suitcase together.
Oh,
Yep.
right. It's all tied closed.
Yep.
Although I still think the big boy, maybe because he's a little bit older, he looks like, yeah, there's something going on. Maybe, you know, he's watching and observing, and maybe is almost, as I said before, maybe a little bit in awe of what's going on around him. And the little girl, yes, she does the little girl in front of him, not the baby. She looks, I'd say, probably a little more fearful. She's not quite sure what's, he's more
Ellen?
optimistic. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and you know, if you can imagine, because I think that's a very valid point. If you can imagine, these folks have just come across the ocean, likely not in first class, taking a look at them. They probably don't speak English. You know, it's their first day in America. As you said, it looks like a single mother. There could be a father here that's just not in the photograph. We don't know, but very much. I'd be afraid to do it, and I'm a grown man, so you know the kids are probably scared. So I think you're very right. A couple things in the chat. And Micah Jean asks, what is the card on his hat? And then Hillary responds, probably an ID. And that's, put it bluntly, that's probably good a guess as any. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to make out, Hillary and Micah. It looks like there might be the image of a bird on this card, like a bird in flight is kind of what I'm seeing, but it's completely open for interpretation. It's just not clear enough for me to really make it out.
I still think it's some sort of identification. There's a sign behind them with a similar shadowy
Here?
No, way behind with that looks like the same thing that you're seeing on the card, back behind, like on one of the railings behind. Yeah, no, yeah, that one. in the back. Anyway, I think they all look afraid and unknowing, but what I'm really struck by is how old the woman looks in spite of the youth of her children. So, I mean, I look at photos of my own grandmother and how old she looked when she was much younger than I am. And I just think life was really hard for immigrants then. And she, I mean, the look on her face and the way her face looks so old is just very telling to me of what she's been through to get where she is in this country right now.
I agree 100%. And that's probably the first thing I noticed when I saw this photograph initially was how worn out the mother looks, you know.
Mm-hmm. I thought the exact same thing as Hillary, but I was noticing Hillary, I don't know if you noticed, sort of, you know, her face looks really lined and, you know, it looks like she might have some sort of sun damage across the bridge of her nose. But I was noticing that her hands, though, looked younger.
Maybe.
So, I mean, you know, it's like one of those things where one of them doesn't quite match, you know?
Although I can only presume she's done hard work with her hands. And probably the boy has done some work too.
You know, it could be a grandma that's minding the kids while mom and dad are off, you know, taking care of whatever.
Right. In the immigrant experience, my own grandparents were immigrants just before 1900. I'm not sure. I've seen this show, but I'm not sure what the date of this particular photograph is. But in the immigrant experience, frequently families came in different waves, like, you know, maybe the mother and the kids came first, or maybe the dad is already there and finally was able to bring them forth. I don't know, but yes, I think they look scared.
But you know, she could be older than being a young mother, but maybe she's in her 30s or maybe even early 40s, because he looks like sort of a young teenager. And then of course there's the baby. So it could be any range and more. I was wondering when I was looking at her face, you said the sun damage. I was wondering if it was dirt, you know, and she does look tired, and that may be why she looks older.
I mean, anything is possible, and I think that's possible. Hillary made some really good points there. I kind of love that idea of the intergenerational joining, you know, once the parents maybe got established. I'm also struck, Hank, by the two girls are kind of making the same gesture. You know, how you see siblings when they do something, you know, some sort of tick, and it's so similar. You know, they're both sort of got their hands up close to their mouths. It just, you know, tells me that they're in the same family.
It would be really interesting to have a photograph of similarly situated Central or South American families side by side to see if the looks on their faces are the same, because I imagine that experience is frightening for everybody as they set out and get to whatever they imagine. And it'd be very interesting to find a similar photograph today.
Wouldn't it? And Micah Jean in the comments is very powerful and heartbreaking right along that same line. Wonder what happened to them. Hope they managed a happier life. And, you know, as I mentioned in the intro, this was Lewis Hines' first foray into photography was when he was a teacher, and he took the class to Ellis Island. And just as it struck all of us, it obviously struck him because he realized the value of these photographs. You know, look how we're reacting to them. And an interesting note is the title of this exhibit, Our Strength is Our People. This photograph is from the early 1900s, I think around 1908. But in 1938, he applied for a Guggenheim Fellowship And his proposed project was entitled Our Strength is Our People, and that's where the name of the exhibit comes from. In that exhibit, he sought to create a sympathetic overview of Eastern European, Southern European immigrants. He didn't get the fellowship, and some people think it may be because we were approaching war. War was already starting to break out in Europe, so anti-immigrant feelings might have been on the rise, and that could be the reason he didn't get the fellowship.
Hank, before we move on, because I know we're going to have to move through these quickly since there are 4 today, but, you know, I think we've all noticed that they look kind of tired, worn out, and wrinkly, but I also am noticing what the little boy is wearing. He's got on a suit and tie. You know, he's looking kind of dapper in his suit, and I was also noticing his and his sister's shoes. They're really kind of fancy. You know, he's got the shoes that sort of cross over and button on top, and she's got these fancy boots that kind of do the same thing. They cross over and look like they have some buttons here. And, you know, it's like they're at the end of the road, which is also a new beginning, and they're, you know, sort of putting their best foot forward.
Maybe
You know, I noticed.
that they have.
What's that, Ellen?
That maybe those are the only clothes that they have, because even the little girls are, you know, in little dresses and the bonnets that, you know, and also we're appearing here. So let's put on our best clothes. You know, we have to, shall we say, let the immigration authorities know that, you know, we're healthy, we're fit, and that may be a lot of it, you know, for appearance sake.
Yes.
Because that was the thing. If something did not look right, they would say, okay, you know, you're going back.
And Hillary, you were agreeing with that in the comments.
Mhm.
And Micah, I'm sorry, you were saying?
Oh, this is enthralling. I noticed the buttons in the shoes as well. And my only thought was that if they are from Italy, then they're bound to have some really beautiful shoes, even if they're, you know, not wealthy at all.
I was thinking the same thing. You know, I love the way we fantasize these people and their stories. And I think our imaginations are great.
Hank, Sandy had said in the chat, do you think those suitcases are theirs and other things that they might be bringing?
Well, the suitcase obviously has a name on it, Anne or Anna, and then I can't read the last name. So I think they are theirs. I mean, the boy is just carrying a sack. That's why he has on his good clothes. The other ones can get wrinkly in the sack.
I'm actually wondering about the suitcases, like that whole stack of suitcases behind them.
That's a lot of luggage.
And the ones in back,
Mm-hmm.
although they could belong to somebody else.
Yeah.
It could be. But just to kind of wrap things up so we can move on, I think we've demonstrated this is a great photograph because of our discussion. You know, we've come up with some good stories, some good thoughts. It's touched all of us. You know, we really empathize with these folks. So I think he was very successful in this piece of documenting the arrival of immigrants in this country. So Italian family looking for lost luggage, 1905. I said 1908. You know, and it's gel and silver print on paper, 13.5 by 10 3/8. So excellent photograph. All right, good job, folks. Let's move on to the next one. So take a few moments and then we'll talk about it. All right. What do you think's going on in this photograph?
These are newsboys. My grandfather, I remember my grandfather seeing this photo at some point, or something like it, and making comment that he was one of these kids that went out, they all did, they get the newspapers off the trucks and then they go out and scatter, and that's basically what they are doing here. They're getting ready to go sell newspapers. Child labor, I mean,
Isn't that cool?
even as a kid, it was young kids distributing the newspaper, you know, growing up.
Right, exactly. This is, and I saw that in the chat as well, a comment about child labor. And that's exactly, this is part of the photographs that Lewis Hine took of child labor. So you're exactly right, and these are newspaper delivery boys. Anything else that we can see here?
Again, I'm noticing what they're wearing, and I'm noticing that this little guy in the center is wearing some sort of tie or kerchief or something sort of around his neck, which to me seems a little incongruous with his turtleneck sweater, but again, sort of dresses him up.
I think it just,
The other
I think
kids
it looks like a muffler. I think that scarf looks like a muffler. They all have on coats. One of them has on a sweater under his coat on top of his shirt, the guy in back. So I'm assuming they're doing whatever they can to keep warm that early in the morning. It's really early in the morning.
Well, and just to give you some context, in the title, and on child labor, Lewis Hine made his titles very explanatory of what we were looking at. And this is 1 a.m. in a blizzard. So you're right, it's very early in the morning and it's cold.
You know, I remember when, I don't know if your dad mentioned sort of what time he started Ellen, but my brother delivered papers when he was, I think, in high school, and he went out, I think, around 4 or 5 a.m. So did your dad ever say what time he got started, Ellen?
It was my grandfather.
Oh, your grandfather?
My grandfather on the Lower East Side, when he grew up on the Lower East Side. In fact, he was actually born in the United States in 1894. My great-grandparents were the immigrants from Poland. And my oldest great aunt was born in Poland. She came over as a baby. All the others were born here. But that's irrelevant. But that was like very common. He used to tell me these great stories about growing up on the Lower East Side and the fights between the Jewish groups and the Italians and the neighborhoods. And yet they could all be friendly. And this looks like, you know, it does look like that kind of a group. It's a mix, and I think they're almost like in awe of the camera. The photograph being taken. Look at them. You know, it's like, hey, here we are. You know, take a picture of us.
But they're not looking at the camera.
Mm-hmm.
Or the photographer, I should say. They're all looking in one direction, which is interesting.
You know, it's one of those things where I think that they're looking at the flash. So, I mean, he would have had his camera sort of in front of him, but they used to, you know, hold the flash over to the side. And it, you know, if at 1 a.m., if, you know, that's when this photograph was taken, it would have been really dark outside. And so, you know, when that flash went off, it would have really illuminated the scene and probably attracted their attention and lit them in a pretty unnatural manner.
One thing I noticed, just like the previous photograph, these people do not look happy, you know, and part of me thinks they look like that they just want him to hurry up because they got to get back to work. You know. What else can we see?
I used to do a lot of black and white photography, and it's my great love. And look at the crispness of the folded newspapers on the left.
Yeah.
I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah, yeah.
I will say, yeah, but he found his calling with photography, didn't he? So any other comments on this one?
I would only,
The little guy on the right, the front right, this guy here, whoever said, they were anxious to get going, just be done already so we can get going. This little guy on the right, I think, is the best example of that from among the group.
I'm drawn to the fellow in the back
Yeah.
who's got a look of curiosity. It's
This
different
one?
from the others. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think he's almost laughing. And he looks a little bit older, maybe because he's taller, but there's something about him that, like, the one next to him looks very serious, but he looks almost like he's laughing. It's like, okay, I'm smiling for the camera, and yeah, let's get, get out and get going, especially this one in the front with the muffler. It's like, okay, what, come on, we're ready, let's go. I love making up stories.
That's the whole purpose here, isn't it? So, go ahead.
I was just looking at the chat that Hillary said Heinz photographs played a huge role in the reform of labor in this country, cannot be underestimated.
And that is very true. He was a big proponent of changing the laws, and he actually, the immigrant family that we saw, we don't really know much about because, like I said, likely they didn't speak English. And also, from what I understand, he just stopped as people took their picture and everybody went on their way. With the child labor photographs, he often would interview the kids. And when we get to the last one in this group, which is another child labor, we'll have more detail. What I was saying about this photograph is a lot of these boys did not speak English. Only a few could, but I did read that several of them had been out this for 2 or 3 years. So you look at their ages here and you go back 3 years, you can imagine how young some of those folks were when they started delivering papers.
Well, these kids growing up on the Lower East Side, and this I could, definitely I've heard the stories about, they all went out and found jobs like this, either that or maybe they were delivery boys, or even the little girls worked at sewing and maybe even cleaning, whether they were Italian or Jewish or Polish. They were immigrant children living on the East Side, and also the other dynamic was they had to do everything they could, A, to support their families, and B, even, in terms of maybe thinking in terms of getting ahead.
Exactly, Ella. That's a very valid point, that it was entire families had to work. Immigrants probably weren't paid that much. So they, to support a family, the whole family had to work.
Many of these immigrants became doctors and lawyers and business people because they started at this very young age, scrambling and figuring out ways, to get ahead. You see, you read the bios of many people, number of whom are, have since passed away, or most of them have. That's where they started out.
Yeah, exactly. That work ethic, and really it was more survival as much as anything, but we're spoiled today, huh? Mm-hmm. So Christy, let's go ahead and move to the title slide. So as we talked about, Newsies at the Brooklyn Bridge, starting out at 1 a.m. on a blizzard from 1908. All right, let's go to the next one. So take a few moments and we'll talk about that.
That's such a fabulous one.
All right, so what do you think's going on in this photo? So let me ask you a question about this. So if we look at this photo and we think about the previous two that we saw, how is this one a little bit different?
This looks like it's in a factory. Now, did Lewis Hines, I have a question. Did Lewis Hines travel throughout the country, or were most of his photos done in New York City? Because this, for some reason, could seem to me like in a factory in, say, Detroit, you know, an auto well,
He traveled.
pardon me?
He traveled.
He did travel.
The next
Okay.
photograph we'll see is from, I think, South Carolina. I don't know if the title of this one gives us any indication, but Hank, you read up on it. Did it say where this one was taken?
I didn't see that, but I will look right now because I got some notes in front of me. But you are right. It's a little different in that this is part of the American workers as opposed to the immigrants and the child labor photographs that we looked at. And Hillary says after Hurricane Katrina, the New Orleans paper duplicated this photo using a man in the turbine room of the main water plant.
This one looks a little more staged, you know.
Exactly, and I think it likely is more staged.
It's extremely graphic.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, it has a design quality that's
Everything round.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
mean, I guess I don't know why I never would have thought that big machines have big tools that somebody has to work, but it just seems that that wrench is so exaggerated and the bolts are so big. But I guess that's right. You don't think about, in our time, we've got machines that actually make the machines and service the machines, and that people can sort of, facilitate that happening. But people aren't necessarily sitting there with this ginormous wrench, moving the bolts. But yeah, I guess that there's always steps in that process. It just seems like, man versus machine, that there are these great big machines that people still are needed to make them function.
He's so muscular.
Well, and I think as I think it was Sandy mentioned it, it looks more staged, so we're showing off his muscles. And to me, the muscles and the machinery, I think they're sort of he's like comparing them to they're both big and, for lack of a better word, muscular things, the man and the machine.
He also looks fairly young, like maybe he's in his late teens, maybe early 20s. And he's very clean shaven, and his hair is styled almost.
Mm-hmm.
Like it is almost staged.
Well, and to your point, Ellen, actually, when Lewis Hine first opened a studio, he called himself a social photographer. And then later on in his career, he changed it to an interpretive photographer. And I think this is a good example of that transition of how he looked at his work.
Mm-hmm.
What do y'all think this machine does?
I think it runs some sort of either electric or water turbine. I mean, there's no right angles in this photograph. Well, there's something straight parallel along the bottom, but everything is curved in this entire photograph. That's the only straight line down at the bottom, virtually. I mean, the wrench is straight, but I don't know, maybe it's in the subway or at a train, it's something that moves because of the roundness of that piece.
You said steam, and that makes sense to me because I'm seeing like valves
and that thing
here and here
and the
here.
pipes.
Mm-hmm.
And the big thing across the top, the big,
And in order to sort of contain that pressure, you'd need something really thick and sort of bulky.
And it is a power plant. So I think initially you were going down that pathway, so you were correct. But you make a good point as far as everything is curved. There's no right angles, no straight lines. And if we think about line, and we think about straight lines and angles and versus curved lines, what typically is the difference?
I was just going to say that I don't know if I'm going to answer your question, Hank, but to me, it's so industrial. You know, it's just, I mean, what could be more industrial? And yet the machine and the circles and the little circular thing in the back, it has its own beauty. I mean, the design is rather beautiful, I think.
Well, and actually, Gina, that was kind of where I was going. You know, typically when we see straight lines, right angles, and that kind of thing, those tend to be in inorganic objects, man-made objects. You know, whereas curvy lines tend to be found in organic objects or in nature. And even though obviously this big steel power plant is inorganic, the photograph is all using lines that are, you know, typically associated with organic objects.
The other two photographs were basically personal. It seemed more personal and involved the families, and they were actually appeared to be candid. This, like has been said, it looks like it is staged. Including the whole design of it, like you said, the curved lines, the way everything is laid out to, you know, draw your eye in, almost more to the machinery than to the young man.
And you know what, Ellen, you had said that the other two were very personal, and I noticed sort of straight at the beginning when this image came up on the machine, on my screen, that we couldn't see his face. And in the previous two photographs, you know, we could see all of their faces, we could read their expressions, and we could sort of imagine what they were going through. And his face is, you know, not only in profile, but most of his features are obscured by shadow. And so it's hard to connect with him as a person in the same way that you could in the previous two photographs.
It almost looks like he's a model.
Yeah.
He was picked to model for this, as opposed to the other two were candid, real people.
I feel like he's been working. If you look at his pants, there's dust and a little bit of debris.
I agree.
And I think he was working, and that he was asked to hold that certain pose. Of course, I'm making that up. Who knows?
Do you think though, do you think the lighting is, I mean, because it looks to me like it's lit so differently. It's not harsh like the other ones were. I mean, it has a gold almost shine to it.
I think that
The lighting does give it more of an artistic bent than a documentary bent like the previous photographs. I think that's very valid.
Go ahead, Virginia.
Oh, I was going to say, I think that the pose was chosen deliberately because the curve of his body mimics all of the circles that are in the photo. And to me, the photographer is trying to say, here is the man that is part of the machine, because his body follows that pattern.
I think that's a great perspective. I think, like Micah said, I think he's working too, because Christy mentioned how big that wrench is. It's almost the size of his arm. You can't just flex your forearm and make a muscle happen unless you're actually doing something with it. And also, can you sort of notice a little set of his, just above his jaw or to the right of the indent on his jaw, you can see where he's having to sort of grit his teeth to make this happen. Yeah, I mean, and I don't think his hair, I mean, knowing what we know about the way they did haircuts back then, they put a bowl over your head and cut around the bowl. So you can see, I mean, you know, even though today's haircuts claim to be some kind of new thing. They're just like that. But yeah, I think he's actually working. I think he's flexing and working.
But I think that he was deliberately picked to it for it, as opposed to Lewis Hine just walking by and saying, hey, that's a great shot. I think that there still is more of a staged feeling as compared to the other two photographs, which were much more candid.
So with that said, do you think maybe then one reason we've got this handsome muscled man is he thought that would make a better photograph than say the guy next to him kind of thing?
Possibly. That's my story.
Although you could look at those newsboys as pretty much staged too. You know, if that's his style, staging, and you know, I'm going into kind of an Errol Morris explication here, but if that's his style, staging photographs, the newsboys could easily, you could see them as being staged rather than just being caught as they pick up their newspapers and go off for the day, because they're all together.
Yeah.
And they look organized by height, by, you know, like the way they're facing.
Mm-hmm.
And that paper, like, was it you that had said that before? They're so crisp and clean that they look like a fan.
Well, that's how they would come off the trucks. People who were, you know, in delivery. And since I worked in newspaper publishing not that many years ago, and they would come off, even, you know, nowadays they come off nice and crisp and clean, and then they're distributed, you know, to the people who are going out to put them in the mailboxes. Yeah. So that is the way that they are, the way the newspapers come out. And I just see them as the kids just clustering around, you know, okay, and then they're going to go spread out.
Well, exactly. And I'm, you know, to the point about them all being staged, you know, what I'll say is I think none of them are what I would call candid, where you just went out and shot people on the street going about their business. I think, you know, in the Immigrant Family and the Newsies, he did say, hey, you know, gather together, I want to take your picture. Whereas on this one is, I think, very much more posed. Those weren't quite as posed, even though they were deliberate. He got the group together and took their photograph. You know, as Virginia said, the curve of the man's back, you know, mimics the circle of the valve. You know, if you look at the muscles in his arms, they mimic the spokes. So I think very much, it's very much more posed, you know, than the last one. He probably arranged this guy and then took the photo, whereas the last ones, you know, the way I look at him anyways, he did pull the group together, but that's as far as the posing went. Maybe in the boys, he said, hey, tall one's in the back kind of thing, but beyond that, I don't think they're as posed as this one is.
Agreed.
Yeah. I think, or it was like almost a natural grouping, and, you know, he just sort of let it go the way they were, you know, as they were going out to, you know, get the newspapers delivered. And even the family, I think the first family, they didn't even really, I don't think they even really knew the photo was being taken.
Right. Exactly. So excellent observations on this one.
Did anyone, just real quickly, I had to leave the room for a minute. Did anyone mention that his jaw looks clenched?
Yeah.
Yes.
And that he's actually, yeah, okay.
But yeah, we kind of, maybe why he left the room, I think we kind of, the consensus was that he's not a model, that he was an actual worker. That there's a possibility he might have been selected for this photograph because he is young, muscle bound, and nice looking, and that made a better photograph. But we think he was an actual worker.
Oh yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So excellent. All right, let's go ahead and look at that title slide. In Powerhouse Mechanics, as we said, it's a powerhouse. This is from 1920 to 21. So this is a bit later than the previous two photographs that we looked at. They were from the early 1900s, 1905 and 1908. And as I said, this is when he kind of moved from calling himself a documentary or sociology type photographer to an interpretive photographer. And we kind of saw that, you know, and I heard that in our discussion, that it's much more posed, much more artistic, so to speak, than the previous two. So let's go ahead and look at the last one, which is my favorite of the group. So go ahead.
While we do that, just a comment on vocabulary. You know, I've seen that photograph a million times, and powerhouse to me just means something that's really powerful. I didn't think about the fact that a powerhouse meant powerhouse, like, you know, a power plant. Just thought, yes, he does look very strong.
Let's take a few moments and look at this one, and then we'll talk about it. So what do you think's going on in this photograph?
Young immigrant girls are working. I'm not quite sure what the factory is, but again, the child labor, and in this case, it's the young girls going out and getting jobs.
Looks like spools of thread.
Right. So I think we see young girls working in a factory where there are spools of threads. So it's likely in the textile industry.
Okay.
And the young girl in the forefront with her torn apron, and I don't know, it's very emotional to me.
Well, and they are not wearing masks of any kind, which we can relate to today. However, the risk of fibers and linters in their lungs, it creates a huge health risk. So there was no OSHA here.
Well, very good. In addition to taking advantage of child labor, they also took advantage of no safety standards.
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
How old do you think, does everybody think that girl is?
Young teens.
Yeah, 10, 12.
Yeah. It's interesting to look at the shoes. They were similar in a way to the good shoes being seen in the first photograph, but it looks like they've gone through a lot of wear and tear. It's like these were, you know, they maybe were good when they landed, but after going to work and, you know, going through life, and maybe their only pair of shoes, that's how they end up looking now. And same even with the rest of her clothes, like the torn pockets. You could see, you know, they didn't have the selection of clothes to wear, and they wore just whatever they could and had.
Which seems a little odd to me since she's working in a mill. You know,
This is in the South, so they did not have fine Italian leather shoes.
But I was just thinking, you know, she's in you know, this is a big machine to weave cloth. So you'd think that, you know, the quality of her clothing might at least not be torn.
But she couldn't
working in a place that, you know, she would have access to.
No, that was absolutely factually not true.
No?
I mean, this actual photograph was one of the ones that spurred Frances Perkins, who was FDR's first female. She was the first female cabinet maker, cabinet member, I'm sorry. This is one of the photographs that spurred her to do the labor reform. She was a worker rights advocate, and actually these photographs provided the precursor to what we know as OSHA or any labor laws that protected workers. And yeah, I mean, this photograph is so poignant to me. Every time I see it, and I've seen it 1,000 times, it makes me sad each time. I mean, this was almost slave labor, children. They were in the
And think of the noise, think of the cacophony of sound that is being generated in this environment. To me, I see this lonely child and this monstrous machine. And
So, yep.
God, yeah.
The other thing is getting back to the clothing. It's not like, it's also that here she is probably working, to make fine, very, possibly very fine fabric and materials. And yet, she is in a very shabby state. It's not like she can even afford them. And it's not like they would give discounts to their workers like they might do now.
I'm really appreciating the perspective, the length. I don't know how else to frame that, but the length of the photograph itself, the perspective, and the taller female figure at the end. And I'm seeing the light bulbs, and I'm seeing the curtains. It's so crisp, and it's very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, just what Ellen had said, Micah, that perspective of it being sort of out of focus, in focus, out of focus, it again makes it feel really long and makes that feel like a monstrous machine. I'm just wondering, does anybody know how these machines work? Like what would be coming off of this, and like where is the cloth that would be coming off of this?
So this,
on the other side, these are looms.
yeah, this may not be a real full loom. This may just be the spooling process.
So like this would be the back of it, and the
you can see, look at the lower left hand corner at the actual machinery that's coming down, and the yarns are coming from above. And they are being woven together by this machine. If you saw last Sunday's Wall Street or New York Times, there was an article about the Keristan factory in North Carolina. And this is exactly the kind of loom that they use to make those rugs. Now, whether this could be rugs or it could be dress cloth, broadcloth, whatever. But the yarns come down, and then the machine goes across. You can't see me because my video isn't working.
So is what I'm seeing sort of to the left or behind that, the really dark things, is that sort of the cloth, those areas of lightness? No, I have a pointer. I'm pointing to my screen. Like these things here. Is that the cloth sort of in the machine woven? Sort of underneath some works?
I do not know. I have not seen a machine of this size, but you know where we could see one is at the Grove Park Inn.
So
kind of here.
Underneath
that.
This is cotton being, this is the spooling of the cotton after it has been, made to, into the, threads. And I'm not sure it's getting woven here. I'm not sure it's just not just getting, put onto the spools where it goes to another machine.
I think you might be on the right track, Hillary, because the title of this is Cotton Mill Spinner. So I think maybe at this point it's spinning the cotton into thread or yarn or whatever. So that
what do you think she's doing? What do you think she's like? What is her job, do you think?
Quality control or something.
I think she's monitoring. She's monitoring and making sure everything's working correctly and there to correct anything that's malfunctioning, maybe. But I keep being drawn to her face and how beautiful she is. And when I look at photos like this, I always wonder what happened to her. What happened in her life.
So, and Mike, as you know, it's a perfect segue because we got a few minutes left. So just to give you a bit of detail on this photograph, this girl is 9 years old.
Oh,
She had worked at the mill for a year and a half when this photograph was taken. So she stopped her education in the 2nd grade and worked 11-hour shifts at the mill at the age of 9. Actually, the age of 7.5 is when she started. She actually did work at the mill her entire life, and she died at age 52 of a stroke. So that's the information I had on her. So, and this is, right down the road, so to speak, in Lancaster, South Carolina, where this was taken.
Did you say she worked her entire life in that mill?
Yes.
How did you find out where the information about her, her background?
So on these photographs, what Lewis Hine would do is he would use subterfuge to get into these factories. He would pretend to be an inspector or a vendor or whatever, and sort of sneak in, and he would interview his subjects while he was in there. I read that because he was so afraid of being caught, he actually would keep his pencil and paper in his pocket, and he would write the notes while his hand was in his pocket when he was interviewing these kids. So, so that's where all the information comes from, is he actually interviewed these children and got their stories.
And then he put them in his books with the photographs.
Yeah. So, and as several folks have mentioned, he was very much a part of reforming the whole child labor thoughts. And one quote of his that I'll share with you that I kind of thought was very appropriate is he said, there is work that profits children and there is work that brings profit only to employers. The object of employing children is not to train them, but to get high profits from their work.
Right.
And I think that, this whole exhibit, as far as the cheap immigrant labor, the folks coming over, the child labor, the gentleman at the power plant, I think they're all, even though these all come from early 20th century times, they're very pertinent to a lot of the issues that we're seeing today as far as labor and profits, and as opposed to what people actually were earning, kind of thing. So very timely, even though these photographs are from 1908 through the 1920s.
That's so spot on, Hank. I was thinking just now about the fields in California, the workers in California that supply this country with food.
What's coming to my mind is that fabric was spun in South Carolina, and then it would be brought up to New York to the factories, and then of course the famous Triangle Fire.
Right.
Yeah, and where I don't even remember the number of women, primarily women, who were killed in that fire. They couldn't escape, and it just seems like this was in South Carolina. The other photos, we're not sure where the power engineering photo was done, but the others were done in New York. And it's amazing how he traveled all over, and yet so different, yet all the same.
But go to your closet and look at the labels on where your clothing was made.
China. And
we have a soft closet. We've just moved it. Yeah.
Yeah.
India, Bangladesh.
Yes, right. And it's the same kind of situation.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And I'll wrap up by saying, that Lewis Hine, despite his talents as a photographer and his ability to document this, he died in poverty.
Wow.
Because, like many social justice warriors, he lost a lot of patrons. The government, didn't really, he had a WPA, some photographing for them that fell through. They didn't want to hear this. And there again, it's not that different from today. So any last thoughts or questions? Well, I thank you all very much, and for another great Slaughter Friday. And if you do get an opportunity to go down to the museum, this is an outstanding exhibit, one of my favorites.
Thank you, Hank.
Can't wait.
Yeah, it's
Can't
really
wait to
great.
hear.
Yeah, Micah, come on down and see us.
I'm
We're
so
open regular hours, Wednesday through Sunday, 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. And we're open late on Thursdays until 9 p.m. So we look forward to seeing you all in the galleries. Next Friday, we have Slow Art Friday led by Megan Pyle, one of our touring docents. And she's chosen 3 artworks from our current exhibition, Huffman Gifts of Contemporary Southern Folk Art, that are really fun. And the topic of her Slow Art Friday is folk art stories. So join us for that. Registration through our website. And in the meantime, I hope that everyone has a really great weekend. We look forward to seeing you again on Slow Art Friday. Take care, everybody.